G'day, so I'm going to do a bit of a series on identifying eucalypts. So there's lots of different topics to cover, like online resources, um, books that are available, um, and the one I'm going to look at today is on the juvenile foliage. It's probably one of the easiest ways to identify the eucalypts. The only problem is it means you either have to collect seeds and germinate them and grow them for a few months, or you have to scratch around under trees and try and find some juveniles growing nearby, which, depending on the species and where you are, they may or may not produce offspring in that environment. In New Zealand, where I am, there are some trees that naturalise to some extent. The ones I've seen growing here, probably Delegatensis is probably the main one I've seen naturalising. Quite often see seedlings under that, which are really easy to identify. Nitons often will have, although it doesn't set a lot of seed in New Zealand, it often has often have seedlings growing underneath or nearby. None of the eucalypts really seem to the seed doesn't spread very far. A lot of the, if you see juveniles, they'll most often be right on the edge of their parent trees, or I've very rarely seen them far away from the parent trees. Obviously, the majority of the seed just falls straight down. Doesn't seem to get blown far or carried by insects or animals or whatever. So certainly in New Zealand, I haven't seen any spreading particularly far from the parents. So in general, if you're trying to identify a parent, yeah, you won't have to look far away, but certainly, unless the conditions are right, 9 times out of 10 you won't find juveniles growing underneath, especially if it's in if there's a lot of grass or whatever, where there's no chance for them to get established. Like I say, if you can collect seed and grow them on, that's probably one of the best ways of identifying the parent trees, as that will narrow it down. A lot of the juveniles, as you can see in front of me here, they're quite distinctive, and once you have the juvenile leaves and form, you can narrow down quite quickly what the parents might be, despite the fact that the adults, a lot of the adults look extremely similar. It's a classic example right in front of me here. This one nearest me, which even in the juvenile form I'm not 100% sure what this is, because the adult tree was just one that happened to be at the side of the road, which I thought was Dalrympleana, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Could be Rubida, as they're pretty similar, but I can tell that it's not Viminalis, which is another adult that looks basically identical, which has lance-shaped juvenile leaves, so I can rule that out, as this is totally different. This has got orbicular leaves, so you see they're quite rounded. So if you're using any resource botanical description of the juveniles, you come across terms for the shape of the leaves. Orbicular for obviously orb for round, or alternatively lanceolate, as in lance shaped, so pointed at the end. Another common term, cordate, which is heart shaped. Don't really have any here. Cordata would be a good example of that. Pointed at one end and then concave at where it attaches to the stalk. So it's going to have a look at a couple of these and see some of the variation, and I'll try and illustrate the fact that some of these, even though the juveniles can be very different, and the adults very similar, you'll get the opposite case where occasionally the juveniles can look very, very similar, whereas the adults are very different. like these two here. These, as juveniles, would be nigh on identical. That on the left is slightly bluer. So what have we got? That's Scenario, which as an adult tree has got, it basically retains similar leaves in its adult life and has very, very stringy bark, ropey, thick bark all the way up the trunk. And then on the right, Glaucescens, that gets, in a few years, that will have normal, the standard gum, green lance-shaped leaves, and it will have nice smooth bark. So those will look very different as adults, even though they're quite hard to distinguish as juveniles. Another very distinctive juvenile plant and common here in New Zealand is Vata. Let's try and get this to focus. So these, probably one of the few gums that has a juvenile leaf or juvenile form that's similar to the adult form. Even as a juvenile, the leaves have stalks, so petiolate, more or less rounded stems, ovate leaves, quite dark green, especially that one's had a bit of fertiliser, so it's quite dark green at the moment. They're quite distinctive as a juvenile. Another very distinctive juvenile is in common here in New Zealand is Leucoxylon. You'll see these leaves in pairs attached to the stem, and they're sort of almost a triangular shape, or deltoid as they're called, quite veined. You can see the veins in them quite clearly. It's another quite distinctive eucalypt, quite different to their adult form again. Adult form is pretty typical gum with smooth bark. Over here we've got a Nitens that's probably got a bit big for its pot. They will, if you keep putting fertiliser on them, they'll keep growing. They just grow and grow and grow with a little bit of heat. And as long as they've got light, heat and water, and you put fertiliser, if you put nitrogen on them, they'll keep growing. Probably one of the most distinctive juvenile eucalypts. Sometimes lance-shaped juvenile leaves, sometimes more rounded, usually bluey greeny. This one's quite greeny as I put lots of fertiliser on it. Some of them are more bluish. Probably closer to probably one of the only juveniles that's confused with is globulus. This is globulus here. See, it's quite a different colour. Globulus, being the classic blue gum, it's got that bluer tinge to it. Stalks are white, got that bloom on them. Leaves have got that whitish, waxy bloom, or glaucus, which you can rub off, and greeny blue underneath. But yeah, stem's always very, very whitish like that. Quite distinctive from Nitens, which normally just has greeny, sometimes reddish or purplish stems. But as adults, reasonably similar trees. Obviously Nitens has very, very small fruit, whereas globulus has big fruit. Probably the biggest difference. Nitens pretty popular here in New Zealand. Globulus used to be, there's still lots of old ones around, but not so popular to be planted now as they get hammered by insects. Then you got the ash type trees. This one's Fastigata. These are also pretty common, the common ones in New Zealand: Fastigata, Regnans, Delegatensis, Obliqua. All of those apart from Delegatensis all look pretty similar. So that's Fastigata on the right, Regnans on the left. Yeah, there's really not much in it. They're quite distinctive. There's Juveniles, lance-shaped leaves with a stalk, rounded stems. Be hard to pick the difference between Regnans and Fastigata as Juveniles. Regnans seem to grow faster as Juveniles. That one's about twice the size, in the same size pot, same age. But yeah, and Obliqua again looks quite similar too, just has slightly bigger leaves and probably a bit more droopy. And the only other one I've got here is a stringy bark Globodia, similar to the other ashes. These aren't considered an ash. They do have similarities, they must be more closely related. There's quite small leaves. They almost don't look like a eucalypt. Really reddish stem. That one's got quite big in that pot. And often, you probably can't see on here, but the leaves can sometimes be a little bit hairy, just have fine hairs on them. Can't really see on this one, it's got a bit old, I think. So there you have it. So there's some different juveniles.